The next speaker, I'm going to read the bio because it's over 10 years of experience in front-end development, Microsoft most valuable professional in developer technologies, Google developer expert in web technology, GitHub star and Cloud Media developer expert, OutZero ambassador and Next ambassador, international speaker, teacher at View School and Jamstack Explorer, writer for Ultimate courses, and then there is a fun fact that is that you have a talk in Antarctica. So what do you do in your free time?
Actually, I do a lot of sport. I'm a 4th-degree black belt in Taekwondo.
Okay.
I go running, I do paddle, I do skiing.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
I don't just sit at my computer, I do have a life.
So the stage is yours, please.
Thank you very much.
Welcome, Debbie O'Brien.
Everyone, I hope you all had a lovely lunch and you're all feeling awake, because I'm going to wake you up if you're feeling sleepy. My talk today is all about components, so I hope you enjoy it. So yeah, I've already had the introduction, but I'm going to point out this photograph because I really like it. I actually gave a talk in Antarctica, which was the best tech talk I did ever. Absolutely amazing experience. I gave a talk to the penguins, and they all know about components now, so that's great. They're the future developers of the world. If you ever get a chance to go to Antarctica, I highly recommend it. It is the most amazing place on this earth. So yes, that's all about me. You can follow me on Twitter if you want to know more. I'm going to just point this out as well for the Google Developer Expert Program. If anyone wants to know more information about that, do come and see me, especially if you are a woman. I have nothing against men, but there are way too many of you in here and way too few women in here, right? So let's try and get the diversity more. Thank you. But also because I collaborate with Google for the Women Developer Academy, for the Road to GDE programs and the Women Tech Makers program. So if you are interested in becoming a GDE, come and see me later and I'll let you know what you need to do. So moving on, let's get this roll started. The modern web is component driven, right? We're all building in components right now, am I right? Yes? We've lost the PHP world, great. So yeah, we're all building components, so we're all doing a fantastic job. This is great, so why am I even here telling you about components when you already know all about it? Let me show you. So basically, what is component driven? Component driven, it's a reuse-based approach to defining, implementing, and composing independently or loosely coupled independent components into systems, right? That sounds like a load of jargon, just is, but I just thought it sounded cool, so I just thought I'd put it in there. So this is basically my component, right? And I'm going to show you a little bit about how I'm using and building components. So this is my beautiful product card component. I sell shoes in my spare time. And this is basically what it does. So as I'm hovering over here, you're going to see I've got like the component here. That's a title component. I can show you that this is built up with a heading, a text component, an image component. Now I've got a currency component here. I've got a button component, and everything, that one card component is actually built out of a lot of smaller components. And you're probably saying, that's a lot of work. And yes, it is, but I'm going to explain to you and show you why this actually makes sense. So when you build your component, as you can see from the dependency graph, this component depends on all these other components. And at all times, I can see where that component, what it's using, what versions of each component it's using, so I can easily change out or see what's going wrong, etc., etc. So these components can also be owned by different teams, right? And they can live in different repos or different scopes in the cloud, different clouds. So my card component is a base component owned by the base team. My shoe store is the shoes card because I want to sell only shoes, so that card is owned by that particular team. And then I've got the e-commerce, so that's kind of like the currency component that is used across every kind of e-commerce project or product that I have. So that's how we're going to separate our components so different teams can own different components, and then they're all composed together to be used by one component. So how do we build component-driven? How do we build something like this? That is the question. So we need to think about every component as if it's a product for anyone to use. So when you're building a component, you're not just building that one component for you and for your maybe future self. You're building it for whatever future people are going to join your team in the future, are going to work at that company, and are going to use that component. So your component is actually almost like a mini app in itself. And that's how you should be building your components. So basically your component should have a great developer experience because we care about developer experience. We all want to just have a great time working. So your component should consider your developer experience. It should have different contexts. So you should be able to use it in different ways, in different contexts, with different themings, et cetera, et cetera. It should be easy to use, right? If you're going to take a component and use it, you should build it so that it is easy to use. It should have a great API, obviously well documented as well, so that someone can come along and use that API exactly how they would want to use it. And it should be loosely coupled. I mean, I should say never coupled, but that's very hard. Sometimes you need to couple it to some kind of library or something, but very loosely coupled to other components. Now, if we do this, as developers, we're basically going to write better software. And we all want to write better software, don't we? Yeah? Yeah, exactly. So we're going to write better software. And basically, we're going to be happier, right? We're going to write more maintainable software. So the future junior devs that are going to come along and take over those components are going to have a better time. We're going to write more testable software because we are all writing tests, yes? Yes. 2 people, great. We're going to create a better developer experience for the future developers that are come along and they're going to use our components. And what do the organizations get for this? So the organizations are going to get better software because, you know, they want to have better software as well. They don't want to be rebuilding that site every couple of years. And they're going to be having happier teams. It means they're also going to save time, right? Organizations want to save time, and saving time means saving money, right? And they all want to save money because, you know, money, they care about money, don't they? And we care about money because we want to get paid, don't we? Yes. And we're going to have happier devs, and that's basically what we want. So, easy, right? Let's talk about how we can build component-driven, right? So we want to take your components, and we want to make them themable. Every component you should be able to use, throw in a different theme, put in a different project, and there's your component used throughout different applications. You want it to be composable. You want to be able to compose components together to build bigger and different and better components. You want it to be encapsulated. You want it to be independent. And we're going to go through this in detail in a little bit. And we want them to be reusable so you can reuse them across multiple applications. Okay, easy. Themable, right? Themable is very easy. Are you all theming your components? Yes? 1 person. Great. We're off to a good start. So design your components with themes so they can be used differently in other apps. And it's actually really easy to do this, right? So you want to basically be able to take a product card component, and just by changing the theme, you want to use that product card, because I sell perfume in my other free time, so I can sell shoes or perfume with the same component just by applying a theme. And that's basically how you want to build your components, because let's face it, we're changing themes all the time. Our companies are creating different brands and different products, and we need to be able to make our components themable. Right? We want them to be composable, which basically means we want to compose smaller components together to form more complex and bigger components, right? Just composing them together, it makes our life easier. And basically this would look something like this. So I showed you this earlier where you've got the product card and it's built up of all these smaller components. Encapsulated, so you want exposed interfaces which allow the user to call its functionality and hides the details of the internal variables or states. So, for example, using props to pass down these so that when I get this product card component, I just have to put in title equals, etc., text equals, etc., source, alt, whatever, currency equals whatever, button text equals whatever. You want your components to be independent. I think this is the most important part of this whole talk, is making components as independent as possible. Right? If components are independent, it means that when you're building your component, you're building it in complete isolation outside of the application. And you might be using something like Storybook, for example. That's a great way of seeing your component rendered in isolation. And I'll show you another way of how I do it. But basically, that's the kind of idea, right? If your component can work on its own, then it's going to work in the app. If you just build inside the app, then you have no control of like independently testing it, etc. So components should have their own version and revision history. You should be able to go back in time and use a previous version of that component, or take a future version and kind of like study through the revision history and see, you know, you might have one app that's basically being updated to a new theme and the others on the old theme, and you should be able to import that component and use the 2 versions across 2 apps until they're ready to kind of migrate to the new version. And components should have their own build pipeline, right? Which means you're able to build that one component and, you know, just deploy it, and that component is deployed, and you don't have to worry about, you know, Peter over there who's like not finished his component. You want to go home on a Friday and he hasn't finished his. And we all work like remote now these days with different timetables. So we want to just build, we want to ship, and we want to finish, right? That's the way we should be building. And yeah, components, minimal dependencies on other components. So easy, right? And it looks something like this. You can see I have a card component on version 1.0.11, and the currency is on the first version there, and the image and the button, and they're all on different versions. So you want your components to be reusable. Reusable means you can reuse them in different scenarios, in the same or in different applications. Okay, makes sense. That kind of, we're all reusing our components. So basically my button component can be used in the product card, and it can be used in the hero component, obviously with different stylings and different themes, a primary button, a secondary button, but we're reusing it, which means we have consistency across all our applications. How many of you have like 27 buttons across your apps? I have to maintain them, and it's a nightmare. So you shouldn't have this. With an independent component, you won't have this problem. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how I build components. I'm going to show you a video in a second. I'll press play in a second, but let me just tell you what I'm going to show you first. So this is my button component. I'm using Bit because I work there. So this is the software we use to be able to build independent components. And basically, I'm going to show you how you can see the component and its documentation. Documentation is very important, and not enough of us write documentation. I know it's boring. I know it takes time, but it should be done. So if you document your components correctly, more people will use it in the future. I'm going to show you how I put the Figma design in here so I can have my designs right there next to my component, so I can actually see at all times. The product manager and the designer can see that I actually did the component, the right amount of pixels, because they see pixels like 2 pixels out, and I'm like, come on, really? And I'm going to show you how you can live playground with it and basically be able to see that component in action and change it. I'm going to show you how you can see compositions, right? To be able to see a primary button, a secondary button, hover states, etc. I'm going to show you how the tests can be seen running on the components, because again, you're all writing tests every day for every component, right? And I'm going to show you the dependencies, what your component depends on, as well as the code that's used, so that someone who wants to use this button component can actually see that I write amazing code. And you can see that. And then you can see the revision history. You can see like what versions are available to you. And then I'm going to show you how you could use that component. So you could literally take my component and put it into your application tomorrow and make it like basically yours. So here is the video. I'm going to walk you through it. So basically, this is the overview page, which shows all the documentation. And you can see here's my design, and this is coming from Figma. This is a live embed, which means if the designer changes it, I get updates straight away. These are the compositions, so I can see what kind of states they're in, all the properties, what is available to me as that API of that component. And it basically means anyone can come along and see this component, what it can do, and how it can be used, and can come along and say, right, if I remove the disabled, what happens to that button? Okay, it's very basic. If I was to go down to the link, because designers, make links look like buttons, and I can remove that and see, it still looks like a button, that looks good. If I change it to secondary, I can see what it would look like, and I can see this in real time, so I can really play around with it. Or I can go to the compositions, click on each one, and see exactly what it looks like through each of those compositions. Again, tests, very important. You can see that this component is fully tested, so I can see all the tests are passing, so I know I can trust this component. And it has no dependencies, so that's great, because this is a button component, probably shouldn't have. And again, you can see all the files that make up this component. You can see how it's written in TypeScript, so that's great. We had a TypeScript talk earlier, and you can see everything that goes along here. And the history, you can go back in time and see, you want to see like how I first designed the component and how terrible my design was until I said, I better make a better effort and do it right. So if you go back to version 1, 5 months ago, and this component didn't have, the docs wasn't as bad, it wasn't too bad, but it wasn't as good. As you can see, I had no Figma embed in here, and properties were not as good, and like the colors and stuff is very, very different, right? But if you wanted to use that version, you could install that version and still use that version if you liked it more. And then you can just go back over time and go through the recent version and use that version instead. So how do you use it? You can use it if you're using Bit by just installing it, or you can just use NPM, or you can use Yarn, and we actually now have PNPM as well if you're using PNPM, and you can just install it into your project like you would any NPM library or any other package. And basically that's it. So that's kind of cool, right? Which means I can build components and you can all use them. So that's the components. That's basically what you have to do. And that means when you're building your app, you have components that are decoupled from the application. So every component is built outside of the app and then can be used in my app, in your app, in anyone's app. kind of cool, right? Stealing components, sharing is caring. So now is the question, do we depend on others or do we build our own? So you're like, yeah, Debbie, but that button looks good. But what about other components? Do I trust your components? Should I build my own components? And this is a really difficult decision. And the answer to it is, it depends. And oh, I lost it back. It depends, right? So when you're building, you kind of have to think, do I have enough time? Do we have enough money, resources, developers to be able to build a load of components? Or should we take something that's already been built and just use it and implement it into our code? The great thing about the components that we build at Bit is that even if I delete that button component and you're using it in your app, you'll actually still contain that version. It doesn't matter. You won't get any more updates of the version because I've deleted it, but you'll never, like, it doesn't get eliminated, right? You have like a hard copy, like cached copy inside your app, so you'll always have it. So that's kind of cool. So yeah, there's a lot of libraries out there, and I love this. Why waste time reinventing UI components? We kind of do that, don't we? We all build our own component libraries. And that's a decision you have to make. I can't tell you what's the best one to do. I like this one as well. Completely unstyled, fully accessible UI components designed to integrate beautifully with Tailwind and CSS. So if you're not very good at accessibility and you want to build something like, you know, this combo box autocomplete, then maybe it's good to use one of these components, take it in, put it into your application and use it. Again, your decision. A lot of companies will tell you, we want our own component library. You've got to build everything from scratch our way. And you're like, oh my God, really? So yeah, let's talk a little bit about design systems, right? So anyone here work on design systems? Yeah, excellent. Okay, cool. There's 6 people. Excellent. So you should all be working on design systems or at least using them in some way. So how does it start, or how do we get started with design systems? And you know, you might argue with me and say, no, this is not how we do it. That's fine. Everyone has their way of building design systems. I'm just going to show you what I've been doing with our designers, and you can take away from this however you want to do it. But this is what we're doing. So a designer comes along with the cart page. This is my lovely shoes that I'm buying. And this is the kind of design that the designer has given me to now implement. So I'm a developer. I'm going to implement this. Where do I start? Normally, we just open up VS Code Editor and just start building, right? Yeah? Who does that straight away? Yeah, exactly. This is what we normally do. This is where developers, we just want to build. But we need to start thinking and taking a step backwards. First of all, we need to start with design tokens. And design tokens are a great way for us to be able to use design tokens across different applications, across different, you know, not just a web, but you can use them across mobile as well. So your designer should start giving you some design tokens. And you can get these from Figma, for example. And I'm not using this, but it is really cool, and I need to play around with it. But you can take the design tokens and export them from Figma into a JSON format. And then you could use that JSON format directly in your components, right? I actually built my own JSON rather than exporting it. But again, I encourage you to play around with this one. So this is like what I created. I created a base theme with my design tokens. So the design tokens I had were, you know, the font family, the font size, the font weight, the primary color, the secondary color, the error color, the border radius, the border size, the text color, the background color, etc., etc. Okay, so you can build all these design tokens, which are just JSON files. I'm going to show you one of them. And basically, it looks something like this, right? Very simple. My primary color tokens are just the primary color with the hex value, the primary heavy, primary light, text on primary, primary background heavy. Naming is hard, just, you know, choose whatever works best for you. There's no right or wrong answer here, but something that makes sense. Text on primary, I know that text is going to be on a primary color, so I can understand what that looks like. So then you want basically to have your design tokens as a component. Told you it's all about components. So yeah, these are components, and I created a component that shows the design tokens. So there's a design token viewer, which means the developers can come along into that component and can see basically what is available to them, what CSS var is, so I can just copy that CSS var, or if I'm using CSS and JX, I can just use the border color, and I can see the kind of colors that I'm being given. So again, every single design token is displayed to me as a component, so the developers can easily see it. More importantly, the designer owns this component. So this is not owned by me, this is owned by the design team, which means they come along and, okay, we've got Twitter in there, we've got Slack in there, and if we had YouTube color, for example, that they would just add that color, it would then auto-render here, I would see the new color, and then I'd be able to use it directly. So that's basically the designer's job, to own that and maintain it and update it. So yes, we're using CSS vars. Anyone else using CSS vars? Good, not enough of you. Anyone not using CSS vars or Sass or less, just using normal CSS and not putting any variables? Anyone? One or two? Okay, so we need to change you, right? You need to change. So CSS vars are really easy, and by not hard coding your values in there and using CSS vars, it means that if my primary color changes, it gets changed in one place in that theme component, and then my whole application just changes. I don't have to go back and change it in every single CSS file or CSS component, etc. I've got some hard code values there. They're just default values, just for when I'm building something and I haven't got the theme built in there yet. Again, that's your choice if you want to put default values in. But basically using CSS vars, it's now supported across all browsers, so you have absolutely no excuses. So yes, everyone, CSS vars, or Sass or less, they're also fine. So this is my base theme component, right? So I'm using the purple theme, or the purple is my base theme. And these are the kind of colors that are available to me. So as a developer, I know I'm going to just use primary color, and I'm going to get that purple color, right? And then I'm using a theme provider, because even though I'm a Nuxt ambassador, I also build in React. So this is actually built in React, and I'm basically importing a component that our team created, which basically converts those JSON values, the design tokens, into CSS vars, so I can just use them directly and not have to worry about the conversion. And then I'm just basically creating a theme provider, and I can override it with a custom theme, which means if I don't want to use that purple base theme, I can just throw in any theme, and bang, I've got a new theme. So pink, for example, right? So if I want a pink theme, I can basically just say overrides equals pink, and now I've got a pink theme. My whole app turns pink. Lovely. Again, the designer owns this component, this pink theme, which means if they decide that the primary color, that hot pink, maybe they don't like hot pink anymore and they want to change it to something else, the designer changes that, creates a new version of that theme, and I just update the version across my app, and I get that new color. So it's component time, right? We're developers and we came here to build components. Whatever the designer's doing, we don't care. We just want to build. So what do we do now? We've got our design tokens, we've got our themes. And now what we do, we build. No, we don't build. We actually sit down and we talk to our designer. Anyone here actually talk to the designer, work directly with the designer? Yeah, so that's good. So it's about 30% of you, and the other 60% just go and build and then hope it looks like the design, and terrible. But if you get the chance to work with a designer, it's the best thing ever. Sitting down together and actually going through the design and discussing it. Basically what we did with my designer, we basically sat down and we kind of came up with the same naming strategy. So we kind of built like a wireframe, even though the design had been built, so it's been designed, and then we kind of went backwards, and we kind of said, right, this component is going to live in the e-commerce and be owned by the e-commerce team. This component is going to be owned by the base team. It's going to be called heading. So now in Figma, it's called heading, and in my scope in base, the base component is called heading, or the cart component. I mean, there's very simple names, but like the cart component, we have the same names. So in Figma, if I'm looking for that one, I can find it easily, right? And the next developer can come along and find it easily. So having the same names in Figma, as well as your component names, is really, really, really important. And then you get something like this, right? So you can kind of say, right, this is what it looks like in a wireframe format, this is my design, and then I can go ahead. I can start building now, right? And you're like, no, it's still not time to build. You're like, what? But I'm a developer, I just want to build. So now what you should do is start listing out your components, right? You need to think about what you're going to build. So I'm going to list out the components I need to build. So for this page, I literally needed a heading, an image, a text component, the currency component, the button component, the remove from cart component, the cart items, and the cart component. And just kind of listing it out gives me an idea of what work needs to be done, and then I can, if I'm a team lead, I can say, right, you can build this component, you can build that component. I can also see what components are like already being built, right? So I already might have a button component, so I don't need to build another button component. And the designer's going to know because he's already designed that button component, so they can basically say, right, we've already designed a button component and it's in this scope, and then you can go ahead and find it, especially if you're new to the team. So then we've got to think about the API. Now we're still not building, we're still thinking. It's like, oh my God, developers, why do we need to do all this thinking work? We just want to build. But thinking about the API is really important, right? So you want to kind of like say, right, if I'm building a heading component, I want them to be able to use H1 to H6, for example, and that's what they're allowed to be able to use in this component. My image component should have source and alt, for example, on the loading, and I'm going to make the alt required, right? Because I want to be thinking about accessibility. I want them to all put an alt tag in there because, you know, sometimes developers forget to do it. I actually on the plane was writing tests, and then I found that I had one that didn't have an alt tag, so I'm like, oh my God, Debbie. So yes, we can forget things. So if we put it as required, it means it's going to be like, hey, you can't, you know, deploy this component because you didn't put the alt tag in there. And you might say, like, why am I even creating an image component? This is like just simple HTML. It's just, you know, like an image source and alt. Why make it a component? Why not just leave it as simple HTML, right? There are a couple of reasons, and before I would have agreed with you and said, yes, just use HTML. But as a Nuxt ambassador, I build all my applications, personal applications in Nuxt, and Nuxt recently released the Nuxt image component, which makes images much more performant, and it's very, very cool, and I highly encourage you to check it out. So what did I have to do in my whole application was go along to every image source, it wasn't a component, it was just an image tag, every component, and change it to the Nuxt image tag, and then do that across my whole website. Now, my website is not that big, but imagine that over a company website. If that had been a component, I would have just had to change that image tag once to the Nuxt image tag, and then it would have been done across my app. So that's kind of the reasoning behind why we build and break things down to smaller components. So text component the same, it could be a P element or a span element. The button component, again, I kind of went a bit crazy and did primary, secondary, white, and a counter because I just, you know, wanted to allow to have a plus and a minus in the shopping cart. Use it as a link as well. And you can add all these in for the developers to use. The cart items, so when you're removing, so the component is actually called remove from cart. And that the job of that component is to remove that shoe from the shopping cart. And basically the type is, we had a type talk earlier, so the type is shoe, and it removes it from the cart. So now it's time to build, right? We've like, at this stage, we just want to give up. We don't want to be developers anymore. Like, I didn't sign up for this. But yes, now we can actually go and build, and we can build better components because we have a better idea of how things work. So we can basically just kind of say, right, this is, and how I do it when I'm kind of building out a page component is I put placeholders in. So I'll kind of like put a cart page, I'll start off with that, and then the cart will just be a placeholder, and then I'll go ahead and like go and build that outside my application or outside this page. I'll build that component in isolation, and then I'll install it, import it into here, and use it in the app. So I'll put placeholders in and then just kind of go along and replace them, and then at the end of the day, I'll have this beautiful application, and it will all be amazing. And yeah, beautiful. There we go. So then by the time you've finished something like this, you're going to end up having a component library already built because you started building components without the intention of building a component library. You now have all these components that are now making up a component library that someone else can come along and use to build other applications from, which means you can then keep building by building the home page, the women's shoes page, the children's shoes page, whatever other kind of pages that come along that the company requests you to build. And yeah, then you basically have, I'm just going to show you very quickly here, all your components. You can kind of see them easily. You can go through each kind of scope of where these components are, what's available to you. You can search across them, and you can find a component and then just use them. So compose components to create apps. That's what we're trying to do here. That's basically the objective. You have all these components, and they just basically make up your application. And I'll quickly show you here the shoe store. So this is an app. An app is also a component. Everything is a component. And you can see the composition here. And this, again, I'm using Bit to be able to see this, and the component highlighter, which basically means I can highlight over every single component to see exactly where it comes from, what version it's using, what team owns it. And it just means a project manager or a designer can come along and see, you know, if something doesn't look right, well, why? Maybe it's because it's using a previous version. You're like, hey, you need to update that version because I've changed, you know, whatever, etc. So this kind of makes it really useful and easy to see what's going on across your application. So reuse components in any app, which means I can have a shoe store, I can have a headphone store, I can have a perfume store, and I can have a sports store, and I can easily create more stores just by using those components across, you know, different applications. So I'm almost wrapping up, but I told you everything, it's all about components. What about configs as components, right? And we talked a little in another talk about ESLint and things like that. How many times have you had to like copy and paste an ESLint across different projects, right? It's a nightmare. So what if your ESLint was a component? Interesting, right? So if you create your config as a component, you add all your rules in there. I like to put like no console error, so all my developers get a big error when they try to use the console. I know, only messing. So yeah, but you can do that, and then they won't ship no console logs into production. And if you make it as a component, then you're just going to export it. So now in the index.js of that component, you export it, which means then in the project, in the ESLint of your project, you're just going to basically, using yarn or NPM, add that component that we created, and then you're just going to require resolve and put it in there. And then you can still override and add more rules to it, but you have that base config component that you can use then across all your applications. And when you want to add a new rule, you add it once, and then they just need to, you know, take the next version, and it's just much easier to maintain. And it's not just ESLint, but also Prettier, Tailwind, tsconfig. A great example is Tailwind, for example, because anyone using Tailwind? Yeah, a couple of you. So Tailwind went to version 3, right? And there was a big change to the Tailwind config. So then we had to go across every project and change and put the content one in instead of purge CSS. And if you only had to do that once, and then just like, you know, so much easier, right? So if I worked in an agency for a couple of years, so we had a lot of projects to maintain. So there's a lot of reasons where this is a great idea. So basically, yes, to build component-driven, basically components are truly isolated. You want your component scope to a particular team, so you can own it, you know who owns each component. You want them to be independently versioned, so you can control different versions, use different versions across different applications. You want them to be able to be released independent, so if I'm building one component, I can ship it to production, and you can build yours and ship yours to production when you're finished. And you want it no longer to be coupled to the app. So when you're building your Next.js app or your Nuxt.js app or whatever app you're building your component outside the app, and then you're just importing it in, and then you can build more apps in the long run. And then you can consume them in any app. And that's basically how, in my opinion, you should be building component-driven. But I leave it up to you. Thank you very much for listening. This is, if you want to scan it, you can actually go and see the work that I've done on this demo project. You can't buy any shoes, I'm forward. You can put it in the shopping cart, but you can't pay for them. But if you want to scan that, you can kind of then see how it works and how you can kind of play around with it. And do test out my components, use them in your project, and play around with it and have fun. Thank you. If you have any questions, let me know.
Thank you, Debbie. I have a question before starting with the room.
Easy ones, though.
Yeah, it will be easy. It's few weeks ago we were at a CSS conference and we spoke about components, and the question is always the same: how to speak the same language between designer and developer about components.
Yeah, you need to talk to each other first. Like actually sitting down and saying, right, we're building a component, so you need to get naming correctly. Like basically designers are your friends, and we used to think them as the enemy, but they're actually your best friends. So sit down and kind of say, right, let's build this together. We both want to have an amazing application. We're both on the same team doing the same job. So if the designer might want to say, I want to call this, I don't know, certain name, and you want to call it a different name, well then you just have to kind of like come together and say, look, let's make it this name, right? Naming is what people fight over mostly, I think. But in general, working together, designers and developers, and we need to create a better relationship, and there's great tools out there that are doing that. Figma's doing a great job in that, and there's a lot of other tools that try and create that better kind of like, get rid of the gap between designers and developers. If you can get your developers to understand design and get your designers to understand a little bit of development, it's even better. So like we have our design team who own that component, they actually go in and they can code and release a new version. They know the minimum things they need to do, and developers need to understand a little bit about design as well, because that helps, them understand where they're coming from. So yeah.
Do you remember strong challenge in your career about this?
Yeah, so I have a talk on it, the first talk I ever gave actually, and it was basically the company, they had 12 themes, and they had like, so they were a travel agent and had a lot of like white label branding, and they would then basically go out to the smaller travel agents who would use their booking system, right? Take booking.com, for example. So they would receive all the kind of hotels available to them, but they wanted their logo and their colors, their primary color, secondary color. And a sales rep wanted to basically just go into that travel agent and say, okay, give me your primary color, give me your secondary color, give me your logo. This is what your page looks like. Sign, deal done, make loads of money, right? Our objective was to create that. But at the time, there was no CSS variables being used, no Sass being used, so it was impossible. we had so many CSS like dependencies and one dependent on another that if you deleted something, it just we had so many problems. So we had to basically re-architect just the CSS of that whole site. We used Sass at the time. CSS variables wasn't really fully supported. And we basically used Sass maps, had a whole JSON object, and then used the variables. And they were able to basically then create multiple themes. It's still in use today. And it's basically just cleaning up the CSS. But yeah, it was a massive challenge. At the time, we thought we were never going to get through to this. And we were breaking things to try and fix things. It was a nightmare. They weren't using components back then. They thought they were, but they were not because it was all a bit of a mess. But we learned from that, and now that team is doing amazing. So yeah. But I do have a talk on that. It's on my website if you do want to look back and see it.
Yeah, thank you. I can feel the problem. Any question in the room or no? Yeah, many questions in the room.
Oh.
Be gentle.
Yeah. Start at the back, then it gets easier, no?
Thank you, Debbie, for your great talk.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, let's say I have a base component, as you've shown in one of your slides, which is used by another component, which is used by another component. Now, maybe the team, which is responsible for that base component, wants to update something, okay? And let's say we are using versions, and we are not breaking anything, so maybe it's just a visual thing that changes. Do you suggest any tool or way to know how your change will impact other teams or other projects? So something like a dependency graph of which project's website will eventually use that new component.
Yeah, it's a great question. So at the moment, so what I showed you is with Bit is 100% open source and free. And what we're working internally and haven't released yet is the paid, because as always we have to make money, right? It's the paid version, which is called Ripple CI, which is a continuous integration system that basically renders the components that are being used, and you can see that base component being used in this app, in this app, in this app, in this app, and then that will then, you can decide, right, I'm going to accept that pull request because this is visually what it looked like. It takes a snapshot of what it looks like. At the moment, we don't have that publicly, but it's on the roadmap and going to be released soon. We're using it internally, and it's taking longer than we want to develop, as you know, always. But it's almost ready, and in the meantime, you can basically still import that component, that base component, into your workflow, and then you can see that new version, and then you can say, yes, this looks good, I'm going to accept it or not. So you do have to kind of manually do it a little bit at the moment, but you can still import it and see it, and then it just eject it, right? So you import inject, which is kind of a cool feature that we have, and that's at the moment the best way. But again, things take time, and things are getting better and better, but we're 100% not there yet, and eventually we will be, and things will be easier. But yeah, good question.
Thank you.
So thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. Love the energy.
Thanks.
So earlier you said that our components should be independent and have their own version history. Mm-hmm. How do you manage that? I mean, I imagine that you don't use a repository for your every component, or maybe you have some monorepo strategy, or maybe you manage your versions of your components independently from Git repository. What strategy do you suggest for managing this?
I have another talk on that as well. You can see on my website, but it's a great question. Yeah, so I started off with a monorepo strategy when building, it's just a demo project, right, which is the e-commerce store. And I started off with monorepo, and then it was getting too big. So then we started separating it out into individual repos, which is, if you scan that, there's a README component that will bring you to the GitHub project. And then I had the base components as one repo, the e-commerce is another repo, and the shoe store is another repo, and then I've got the other store and the other store and the other store. And then as I was kind of building it and making it better and stuff, because I'm my own team as a developer advocate, I don't have anyone else on the team, it became just me doing a lot of stuff. So then I was going to a lot of different repos and making the changes, and then updating that component because that depends on that one, and it became too much work. So I kind of, even though I told people in my other talks, like, you know, monorepos are terrible, and then I was like, actually, monorepos are easier. So it depends on who you're working with or whatever. But in my case, I moved things kind of almost back to a monorepo, and you can like see my GitHub repo. It's probably it's actually a mess because it's got the base components are in there, but they're they don't live there, so I can eject them when I want. But for working, I'm importing them in. I can use them. I can play around with them. And then one day when I'm ready to clean everything up and I'm finished, you know, building, I can just eject all the base components out, eject the e-commerce ones, go to the GitHub repo, pull all the changes, and then I've have these nice kind of strategy set up. Again, everyone is different. We're working with a lot of companies and they're building things different. Some are using monorepos. Some are using NX as well, Whitbit, to manage monorepos. Some are just using everything different. But you can use it whoever you want. And that's the great thing, is that you can decide, I want to have things separate. I want to have things all in one repo. It's just your choice of how you want to work. And you can do pull requests to kind of accept changes, not accept changes, etc.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Sorry, but we have just the last question from home. It's Gianluca Bombara. Question about independent libraries. In our apps, we always use a few components. I could create one JS file from this, in example, in web component usage, for not maintain and deploy a lot of files. Or you recommend to generate one file for every component, and why?
So we're talking about Vue, right? Which unfortunately we don't have Vue support at the moment, and until we have someone who can build a Vue compiler to be able to do all that, we're not going to have Vue support for I don't know how long, unfortunately. But if it's kind of like yeah, I don't know if you want to read that out again or if I'm answering it right, yeah. But basically, independent release in our apps, we always use a few components. You create one JS file from this to not maintain and deploy a lot of files. Okay, so forgetting Vue aside, right? So if you're using React or Angular, the only way to build, like the component has multiple files. We have to have an index file. That's something that's important because it needs to export it. And then we have like the main component file. And then we have a docs file to show the documentation. We have a composition file. We have a test file. So we have a lot of files to maintain with one component. So you can decide, I'm not going to write tests. I'm not going to write documentation. I'm not going to write compositions, and just have one file, right? That's up to you. But having the other files to maintain, you know, that one, again, if that question, and again, it's hard when it's online, but if that question means you have a lot of stuff going on in your component, then you're probably thinking that component should be split into multiple components, right? But if it's files, then the files are for compositions and tests, and if it's a big component, split it out into smaller components, then you've got less to manage.
Thank you so much, Debbie, again.
You're welcome. Thank you.